But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. Genesis 6:8.
I'm standing in my laboratory right now, and I can still smell the rain. Not the clean, fresh rain we know today, but something ancient, something that carried the weight of divine judgment mixed with infinite love. My hands are shaking as I write this because 3 days ago I witnessed something that science says is impossible. I traveled back 4,000 years and watched the world end in water. But more importantly, I watched God's love preserve life itself through the most magnificent act of salvation in human history. I saw Noah's Ark with my own eyes, and now I understand why some truths are too beautiful and terrifying to believe. My name is Dr. Eric Ross, and until last week I was a quantum physicist who believed that faith was just organized superstition. I spent 15 years developing what I called the Temporal Resonance Chamber, a machine that could theoretically allow consciousness to observe past quantum states. It was supposed to be about research, about proving that historical religious events were just myths amplified by primitive minds. I never expected it to prove me catastrophically wrong. I never expected to witness the most profound demonstration of divine love that the universe has ever seen. The irony wasn't lost on me. A man who dedicated his career to disproving the supernatural, accidentally creating a window into the very miracles I sought to debunk. But that's getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how a skeptic became a witness to the impossible. How a man who thought he understood the mechanics of the universe discovered that love, not physics, is the fundamental force that holds creation together. Growing up, I'd sat through countless Sunday school lessons about Noah and his ark. Even as a child, the mathematics seemed absurd. 2 of every animal? A flood covering the entire earth? A wooden boat surviving impossible conditions? The teachers would speak of God's love and mercy, but all I could see were logistical impossibilities. By the time I reached graduate school, I'd categorized these stories alongside fairy tales. Beautiful metaphors, perhaps, but nothing more. My doctoral thesis was even titled Quantum Analysis of Historical Impossibilities. I was so certain I was right. I was so blind to the magnificence I was dismissing. The Temporal Resonance Chamber took me 12 years to build. The theory was elegant. If consciousness is quantum in nature, then theoretically, it could be entangled with quantum states from the past. Not time travel in the physical sense, but something far more profound. The ability to witness history through the quantum echoes, still reverberating through space-time. I'd tested it dozens of times on recent events. Watching my own childhood birthday parties, observing historical moments from the past century. It worked, but I needed something bigger, something that would make my career. That's when I decided to target the Great Flood. If I could prove that nothing extraordinary happened around 2400 BCE, I'd finally put these ancient myths to rest. I calibrated the machine for the region that biblical scholars identified as the likely location, the mountains of Ararat, the Mesopotamian plains. I expected to see normal Bronze Age life, perhaps some local flooding that got exaggerated over millennia of retelling. I never expected to open my eyes in a world where the sky itself had turned into an instrument of divine love, where judgment and mercy danced together in the most spectacular display of cosmic choreography ever witnessed. The first thing that hit me wasn't the sight, it was the sound. Have you ever heard the earth sighing? That's the only way I can describe it now, though at first I interpreted it as screaming. The ground beneath my feet, or rather beneath my consciousness as it materialized in this ancient world, was resonating with a deep, fundamental frequency that seemed to emanate from the very core of creation. The sky above was a canvas of grays and blacks that pulsed with purposeful intent. And the rain wasn't just falling. It was descending with the precision of divine orchestration, each drop carrying the weight of judgment and the promise of renewal. I found myself standing on a hillside, my consciousness somehow inhabiting the body of a local shepherd, whose quantum signature had pulled me into this timeline. Through his eyes I could see the valley below, and there, impossible and magnificent, was the Ark. But calling it just the Ark is like calling the Sistine Chapel just a ceiling. This was the physical manifestation of God's love for every living creature He had ever created. Nothing could have prepared me for the sheer scale of it. This wasn't the charming boat from children's books. This was an engineering marvel that dwarfed modern aircraft carriers, a floating cathedral of preservation that testified to divine care for every created thing. The dimensions were exactly as described in Genesis: 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, 30 cubits high. But seeing it in reality, understanding the precision of its construction, the impossible task of fitting every living creature inside, it was like watching mathematics come alive, guided by love so profound that it had orchestrated the salvation of biological diversity itself. The wood itself seemed to glow with an inner light, as if each timber had been blessed by hands that had shaped galaxies. The pitch that sealed it wasn't ordinary tar. It shimmered with an iridescent quality that repelled water with supernatural efficiency. But more than that, it seemed to pulse with warmth, as if the very walls of the ark radiated the protective love of its designer. And the sounds coming from within, the calls and cries of every creature that had ever drawn breath, it was like listening to creation's symphony playing its most important movement, a biological orchestra conducted by infinite compassion. But it was Noah himself who shattered every preconception I'd ever held. This wasn't the elderly, benevolent grandfather from Sunday school illustrations. This was a man transformed by direct communication with divine love, a human being so suffused with God's heart for creation that His very presence seemed to calm the storm. His eyes held knowledge that no mortal should possess, the weight of carrying every living species into an uncertain future, but also the unshakable confidence that came from knowing he served a God whose love would not allow creation to perish. When He looked in my direction, I felt like He could see through time itself, past my borrowed consciousness, directly into my modern soul. And in that gaze was not condemnation for my skepticism, but compassion. The same divine compassion that was preserving life itself through this impossible vessel. It was the look of a father who understood that his children didn't yet comprehend the depth of His love, but who would go to any lengths to protect them anyway. His family moved with purpose that transcended human efficiency, but more than that, they moved with joy. Even in the face of global catastrophe, Noah's wife and sons radiated a peace that could only come from absolute trust in divine goodness. They weren't just loading animals, they were participating in the most magnificent rescue operation in cosmic history, and they knew it. I watched Noah's wife direct elephants with gentle authority, speaking to them in tones of such maternal tenderness that the massive creatures responded like beloved children. His sons guided predators and prey into harmonious coexistence, not through fear or force, but through the same divine presence that had orchestrated this entire impossibility. The animals themselves, they came not driven by instinct, but called by love. I watched as creatures from every continent somehow arrived in this ancient Middle Eastern valley, drawn by invisible threads of divine affection. Species that shouldn't exist in the same hemisphere, walking together in peaceful procession toward salvation. Polar bears from ice caps that wouldn't be discovered for millennia, tropical birds whose colors defied the muted palette of this ancient world, great cats whose majesty spoke of a creator who delighted in beauty as much as function. Each one seemed to understand its role in preserving life itself, and each one came willingly, trusting in the love that had called them home. But it was what I witnessed inside the ark that truly revealed the magnificence of God's love for His creation. The angel I would soon meet gestured for me to follow, and somehow my consciousness was drawn inside the impossible vessel. What I saw there defied every law of physics I had ever studied, but more importantly, it revealed depths of divine love that my finite mind could barely begin to comprehend. The interior of the ark was larger than its exterior dimensions could possibly contain. Not through some crude violation of spatial geometry, but through the same divine mathematics that had compressed infinite love into finite expression. The space seemed to breathe and expand according to need, accommodating creatures of every size and temperament in perfect harmony. I watched as lions lay beside lambs, not through miraculous behavioral modification, but because the ark itself radiated such perfect peace that predation became unthinkable. The atmosphere inside wasn't just air, it was saturated with presence, with a love so tangible that aggression simply could not exist within its embrace. I saw great bears playing gently with small rabbits, their massive paws moving with impossible delicacy as they engaged in games that spoke of a time when all creation lived in harmony. The feeding system was perhaps the most beautiful impossibility of all. I watched Noah spread what appeared to be ordinary grain and vegetation, but as each creature ate according to its nature, the food somehow transformed to provide exactly what each species required. Carnivores found their sustenance in plants that satisfied like meat, while herbivores discovered grasses that contained every nutrient needed for perfect health. It was as if the ark existed in a pocket of Eden, where the curse of death had been temporarily suspended by overwhelming love. But it was the way the animals looked at Noah and his family that broke my heart with its beauty. In their eyes was not just trust but profound gratitude. They understood, on some level deeper than instinct, that these humans were sacrificing everything to ensure their survival. They knew they were loved, not just by Noah, but by the God who had commanded their preservation. I watched Noah move through the impossible menagerie, speaking to each species in tones of such tenderness that language barriers ceased to exist. He knew them all by name, not just species names, but individual names that he seemed to have received through divine revelation. A massive elephant cow he called Majesty, and she would lumber over at his call, lowering her great head so he could whisper words of comfort into her ear. A pair of tigers he called Thunder and Grace, and they would purr like house cats when he approached, their fierce eyes soft with devotion. The organization inside the ark spoke of intelligence far beyond human capability. Living quarters for each species were perfectly designed for their specific needs, with climate controls that created tropical conditions for some creatures while maintaining Arctic temperatures for others, all within the same impossible structure. Nocturnal animals found chambers where eternal moonlight provided perfect hunting conditions for the insects and small creatures they needed, while diurnal species lived in areas where golden sunlight never failed. But perhaps most remarkably, I witnessed what could only be described as interspecies friendships developing during the voyage. A family of wolves had appointed themselves guardians of the smaller creatures, gently herding rabbits and mice to safety whenever the ark's motion became too violent. Their pack instincts had been transformed by the divine atmosphere into protective love that extended beyond their own species. I watched the alpha male carefully lift an injured sparrow in his massive jaws, carrying it to Noah with such delicacy that not a feather was disturbed. The children, for there were young among many of the species, played together in ways that would have been impossible in the outside world. Bear cubs wrestled with leopard kittens while eagle chicks learned to fly alongside butterfly larvae that had somehow been preserved in various stages of metamorphosis. It was as if the ark contained not just representatives of each species, but the very essence of innocence itself. But it was during the storm's peak that I truly understood the magnitude of God's love for His creation. As the waters outside rose to cover mountains, as civilizations vanished beneath waves that moved with supernatural purpose, inside the ark was perfect peace. Not the peace of ignorance, but the peace that comes from absolute trust in infinite love. I watched Noah gather his family and the animals for what could only be described as worship. Without words, they somehow communicated a gratitude so profound that the very air seemed to shimmer with thanksgiving. The animals arranged themselves in natural amphitheater formations, with the largest creatures forming outer rings, and the smallest gathered close to Noah's family at the center. Noah raised his hands toward the ceiling of the impossible vessel, and his voice carried a prayer that seemed to encompass every creature that had ever drawn breath. Creator of all things, we thank you not just for our preservation, but for the love that makes preservation necessary. You could have simply created new life after the flood, but instead you chose to save what you had already made, because your love does not abandon what you have called into existence. The animals responded to his prayer with a symphony that no human composition has ever matched. Each creature added its voice, roars and chirps, growls and songs, calls and cries that blended into harmonies that spoke of gratitude beyond language. I realized I was witnessing creation itself offering worship to its creator, led by the man who had been chosen to shepherd them through catastrophe. That's when I noticed him, the figure I had glimpsed outside, now moving through the ark with authority that made space itself bend to accommodate his presence. He was tall, impossibly tall, with features that were almost human, but carried an otherness that spoke of origins beyond earthly understanding. His clothes appeared to be woven from light itself, and when he moved, reality seemed to celebrate his presence. An angel. An actual, literal angel, overseeing not just the loading of Noah's Ark, but the daily care of every creature within its impossible walls. But this wasn't the stern, warrior angel of popular imagination. This being radiated love so pure and intense that it was almost painful to witness. Every gesture spoke of tender care. Every glance conveyed affection that encompassed the entirety of creation. I watched him comfort a distressed mother rhinoceros by simply placing his hand on her massive head, and immediately her anxiety transformed into perfect peace. He moved among the creatures like a parent checking on sleeping children, adjusting environmental conditions with gestures that seemed to organize reality itself, ensuring that every being within the ark experienced perfect comfort despite the chaos raging outside. When a young giraffe became tangled in what appeared to be hanging vegetation, the angel untangled the creature with such gentle precision that the calf never even woke from its peaceful sleep. But it was when the angel noticed my presence that my understanding of divine love truly exploded beyond all previous boundaries. My scientific mind tried to rationalize what I was seeing, hallucination brought on by quantum consciousness displacement, ancient astronaut theory, mass hypnosis caused by ergot poisoning. But then the angel looked directly at me, through time, through space, through the borrowed consciousness I was inhabiting, and smiled with such profound love that I understood immediately why the scriptures say that the glory of God would destroy mortal flesh. Dr. Eric Ross, he said, his voice carrying across 4,000 years with crystalline clarity that somehow contained infinite compassion. You came looking for proof that God doesn't exist. Instead, you've discovered proof that God's love exceeds anything your limited understanding could contain. How's that working out for you? The impossibility of his knowledge, the casual way he addressed me by name across the centuries, but more than that, the absolute love that permeated every syllable of his voice. It shattered something fundamental in my worldview. This wasn't ancient superstition or primitive misunderstanding. This was divine love made manifest on a scale that reduced all human achievement to cosmic insignificance. You see the flood as judgment, the angel continued, his words somehow reaching me despite the physical impossibility of our communication. But judgment is just love's response to anything that threatens what love has created. The waters aren't rising to destroy, they're rising to cleanse, to remove everything that would prevent creation from fulfilling its purpose. He gestured toward the animals around us, and suddenly I could see them as he saw them, not just as biological specimens, but as beloved individuals, each one known by name, each one precious beyond mortal comprehension. Every creature here represents thousands, millions of their kind that will come after. This isn't preservation. This is love, ensuring that the symphony of creation will continue to play until time itself ends. The angel moved closer to where my consciousness hovered, and I felt overwhelmed by the intensity of divine love radiating from his presence. Your science has taught you to see creation as a cosmic accident, life as a statistical anomaly. But you're witnessing the truth. Every molecule, every atom, every quantum particle exists because love willed it into existence. The flood doesn't contradict natural law. It reveals that natural law operates within frameworks of love too large for finite minds to contain. He gestured toward the ceiling of the ark, and I followed his gaze to witness something that still haunts my dreams with its beauty. The heavens literally opened. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, but with the mechanical precision of vast cosmic machinery, operated by infinite love. I could see beyond the blue sky into depths of space, where swirling galaxies served as mere decoration for throne rooms beyond imagination. And from those opened heavens, water began to fall not with fury, but with the purposeful precision of divine tears, tears of sorrow for what had been corrupted, tears of joy for what would be preserved. But it wasn't just the rain from above. The ground itself began to convulse as the fountains of the great deep burst forth, but now I understood what I was witnessing. The Earth's crust was being systematically renewed by forces that made tectonic activity look like gentle massage. This wasn't destruction. This was planetary renovation, cosmic love reshaping the world to remove everything that threatened the flourishing of life. Through my borrowed consciousness, I could feel the shepherd's terror transform into awe as my modern understanding merged with his ancient faith. This wasn't a natural disaster. This was love in action on a planetary scale. The angel had used that phrase, love in action, as if the flood wasn't judgment, but the universe's immune system removing toxins that threatened the health of creation. The water rose with impossible speed, but now I saw its true purpose. In mere hours, I watched entire cities disappear beneath waves that moved with supernatural intelligence, but the waves weren't attacking. They were cleansing. The water sought out corruption with surgical precision, while somehow curving around innocence as if repelled by invisible barriers of divine protection. I watched civilizations that had taken millennia to build vanish in moments, but through the angel's perspective I understood what was being removed. These weren't just cities. They were centers of influence that had turned creation away from its intended purpose. Societies that had forgotten they were loved, governments that had perverted justice, religious systems that had replaced relationship with ritual, economic structures that had made poverty profitable. The flood wasn't destroying arbitrarily. It was excising cancer from the body of human civilization. And through it all, Noah stood at the helm of his impossible vessel, not with the satisfaction of vindicated prophecy, but with the profound sadness of a man who understood that love sometimes requires allowing consequences to run their course, but also with unshakable faith in the love that would rebuild from the remnant he was preserving. The animals inside the ark had fallen silent, but not from fear. Their silence was reverent acknowledgement that they were witnessing the most profound act of love in cosmic history. I could feel their collective consciousness, somehow amplified by whatever divine presence orchestrated their salvation. They understood their role not just as genetic repositories for a planet about to be cleansed, but as living proof that love never abandons what it has created. As the waters continued to rise, covering mountains and drowning civilizations, I witnessed something that forever changed my understanding of divine justice. The angel gestured toward the rising flood, and suddenly I could see the spiritual dimension of what was occurring. The waters weren't just physical. They were washing away the accumulated spiritual corruption that had poisoned the relationship between creation and creator. I saw how human rebellion had affected not just human society, but the entire natural world. Animals had become unnecessarily vicious. Plants had developed toxins they didn't originally possess. Even the weather patterns had been disrupted by the spiritual discord between earth and heaven. The flood wasn't just cleansing human civilization. It was restoring the entire planet to its intended spiritual state. Watch carefully, the angel instructed, his voice carrying the authority of ages. You're witnessing love's refusal to allow beloved creation to remain in a state that prevents it from experiencing the joy for which it was designed. As the waters reached their peak, covering even the highest mountains, something extraordinary occurred inside the ark. Every creature simultaneously seemed to understand that they were witnessing the end of one world and the birth of another. The atmosphere inside the vessel became so saturated with hope that it was almost visible, shimmering like heat waves but radiating comfort instead of oppression. Noah gathered his family and the animals for what I realized was a celebration a celebration of divine love that refused to let creation destroy itself. They weren't mourning what was being lost. They were rejoicing in what was being preserved and what would be reborn. The angel approached me one final time as I felt my connection to this ancient timeline beginning to weaken. The temporal resonance chamber could only maintain consciousness displacement for a limited time before quantum decoherence set in. But before I lost my connection entirely, he had one more revelation to share. "Tell them," he said, his words burning themselves into my memory with indelible fire of pure love. "Tell them that what they call judgment is actually mercy, mercy that refuses to allow beloved creation to remain in a state that prevents it from experiencing the joy for which it was designed. Tell them that the flood proves God's love, not his wrath. A loveless deity would have simply allowed corruption to continue until creation destroyed itself. Love intervened." He placed his hand on what would have been my forehead if I'd had a physical form, and suddenly I could see everything, the entire scope of divine love from creation to consummation, the intricate web of mercy that connected every moment to divine purpose. I saw how the flood wasn't random judgment, but surgical intervention, removing elements that would have prevented creation from eventually finding its way back to perfect relationship with its creator. "You see Noah as a survivor," the angel continued, his words carrying the weight of eternal truth. "But he's something far more magnificent. He's proof that love always preserves a remnant, that no matter how far creation strays from its purpose, love will always maintain a pathway back to harmony. The ark isn't just a boat, it's a promise made visible, the promise that love never abandons what it has created." I witnessed the moment when the rain finally stopped. Not gradually, but all at once, as if someone had simply turned off a cosmic faucet. The silence that followed was pregnant with possibility. The silence that comes not after destruction, but after renovation. Inside the ark, every creature seemed to hold its breath, sensing that something fundamental had changed in the spiritual atmosphere of the planet. Noah opened a window in the ark, and the air that entered was different. Cleaner not just physically, but spiritually. It carried no trace of the corruption that had necessitated the flood. It was air that had been washed clean by divine tears, atmosphere that could once again sustain the kind of relationship between heaven and earth that had existed in Eden. The dove that Noah sent forth returned with an olive branch, but through the angel's perspective I understood the true significance of that simple twig. It wasn't just proof that plant life had survived. It was a love letter from the renewed earth to the heaven that had cleansed it. The olive branch was creation's way of saying, "Thank you for loving us enough to save us from ourselves." The vision lasted only moments in linear time, but those moments contained eternities of understanding. I saw how modern science, my beloved quantum physics, was just one small voice in a cosmic symphony conducted by intelligence so vast that galaxies served as its instruments, but more importantly, by love so profound that it counted every sparrow and numbered every hair. I saw how every equation I'd ever solved, every breakthrough I'd ever achieved, was just rediscovering mathematical truths that had existed in the mind of God before time began, truths that were expressions of love rather than cold calculations. The universe wasn't running on impersonal forces. It was sustained moment by love so personal that it knew the needs of every creature in Noah's Ark by name. And then, the most beautiful moment of all. As the Ark finally came to rest on the mountains of Ararat, I witnessed the emergence of preserved creation into a cleansed world. But they didn't emerge as refugees from disaster. They emerged as pioneers of renewal, carrying within their genetic memory the proof that love always finds a way to preserve what it values. The angel's final words echoed through dimensions as my connection began to fade. The flood story isn't about God's anger, it's about God's love. Love that refuses to allow its beloved to destroy themselves. Love that preserves even when preservation requires enduring the pain of watching the world be cleansed. Tell them that every rainbow is a promise that love will never abandon creation. Tell them that Noah's Ark is proof that love always finds a way. Then, darkness. The connection severed, and I found myself back in my laboratory, gasping for air I'd been breathing all along. gripping the edges of my temporal resonance chamber with hands that still trembled from encounters with love across millennia. The first thing I did was run diagnostics on every component of my machine, but I already knew what I would find. Everything was functioning perfectly. No malfunctions, no quantum irregularities that could explain what I'd experienced as hallucination. The readings confirmed that consciousness displacement had occurred exactly as programmed. I had genuinely observed events from 400 years ago. But more than that, I had witnessed the most magnificent demonstration of divine love that creation had ever seen. I spent the next 72 hours trying to rationalize what I'd witnessed, but not to debunk it, to understand it. I ran the experience through every psychological and neurological filter I could devise, not to explain it away, but to comprehend how my finite mind had been able to contain even a glimpse of infinite love in action. The details were too precise, too consistent with archaeological evidence I'd never studied. The engineering specifications of the Ark, the geological evidence for massive flooding in ancient Mesopotamia, the sudden disappearance of multiple Bronze Age civilizations around the same time frame. Everything aligned with impossible accuracy. But it was the love that finally convinced me I hadn't hallucinated anything. Love so profound, so all-encompassing, so beautifully demonstrated through the preservation of every living creature. That kind of love couldn't be manufactured by neural misfiring or psychological projection. I could still feel it, radiating from my consciousness like warmth from a fire that would never burn out. The implications nearly overwhelmed me with their beauty. If the flood was real, if Noah's Ark had actually housed every living species through global catastrophe, if angels had orchestrated the preservation of biological diversity through direct intervention motivated by infinite love, then everything I'd believed about the relationship between science and faith wasn't wrong, just incomplete. The universe wasn't running on cold, impersonal forces. It was sustained moment by love so vast that it counted every sparrow, so detailed that it knew the needs of every creature by name, so patient that it would endure watching its beloved world be cleansed rather than allow it to destroy itself through corruption. I tried to go back to my old life, my old certainties, but it was impossible. How do you return to believing in a loveless universe after witnessing love preserve every form of life through global catastrophe? How do you go back to thinking of consciousness as a neural accident after experiencing the mind of an angel who knew your name across 4,000 years? All of it rang with new meaning now, not because the science was wrong, but because it was incomplete. Like trying to understand a love song by analyzing the acoustic properties of sound waves without acknowledging the heart that inspired the music. The angel's words echoed through my thoughts with increasing frequency. Judgment is just love's response to anything that threatens what love has created. I realized that my entire career had been dedicated to understanding the mechanisms of creation without recognizing the love that motivated those mechanisms. But what if love wasn't just an emergent property of complex neural networks? What if love was the fundamental force that held the universe together? Right now, I need to tell you why I'm sharing this account of the flood, why the angel was right when he said that some truths are too large for small minds to contain, but not too large for willing hearts to accept. I'm sharing this because the world needs to know that the flood story isn't about an angry God destroying his creation in a fit of divine rage. It's about a loving God who refused to watch his beloved creation destroy itself. It's about love that was willing to endure the pain of watching the world be cleansed, rather than allow corruption to spread until all beauty was lost forever. And that love, that same love that preserved every living creature through global catastrophe, that love hasn't changed, it hasn't diminished, it hasn't grown tired of caring for creation. Every sunrise is still sustained by that love. Every breath you take is still a gift from that love. Every heartbeat is still evidence that you matter to the one who numbered the animals by name and guided them safely through the flood. Some of you will dismiss this account as elaborate fiction, the delusions of a scientist who spent too much time staring into quantum possibilities. I understand that reaction because it would have been my response just weeks ago. Truth doesn't require your belief to remain true. The flood happened whether you accept it or not. Noah's Ark preserved biological diversity through global catastrophe, whether it fits your theological preferences or not. Angels orchestrated the salvation of every living species, whether modern sensibilities find such intervention comfortable or not. And most importantly, divine love motivated every aspect of that preservation, whether you're ready to accept being loved that completely or not. I've returned my temporal resonance chamber to storage, but not because the discoveries were too dangerous for one person to possess. I've stored it because some truths are too beautiful to exploit, too sacred to commercialize. The device remains available for future research, but it will only be used to reveal truth, never to manufacture evidence for predetermined conclusions. The rain I mentioned at the beginning. I can still smell it. Ancient water carrying not the weight of divine judgment, but the essence of divine tears. Tears of sorrow for what had been corrupted, tears of joy for what would be preserved, tears of love that refused to abandon creation, even when creation had abandoned its creator. If you take anything from this account, let it be this: you are loved, not loved conditionally, based on your performance or your beliefs or your understanding. You are loved the same way those animals were loved in Noah's Ark, completely, unconditionally, with a love that would move heaven and earth to preserve you. You are loved with the same love that guided millions of creatures to safety, that sustained them through global catastrophe, that prepared a renewed world for their emergence into new life. The next time you see a rainbow, remember that it's not just a refraction of light through water droplets. It's a promise that the love which preserved Noah's Ark will never abandon you. It's a covenant written in the sky that divine love is more persistent than human rebellion, more powerful than natural disaster, more enduring than time itself. I was wrong about almost everything, and somehow that's the most liberating discovery I've ever made. Wrong about the universe being impersonal. Wrong about consciousness being accidental. Wrong about love being just brain chemistry. Wrong about miracles being impossible. Wrong about faith being the enemy of reason. But most importantly, I was wrong about being unloved. That's the message the angel wanted me to carry back through time, that divine love doesn't require you to be different before it will save you. It saves you so that you can become who you were always meant to be. The flood didn't preserve perfect creatures. It preserved loved creatures. And that makes all the difference in the universe. But I've also noticed something else. Something that fills me with both hope and urgent concern. Just as the world before the flood had reached a point where love's intervention became necessary to prevent total spiritual destruction, our current world shows many of the same symptoms. Not that I expect another flood. The rainbow promise ensures that water will never again be the instrument of global cleansing, but love may need to intervene in other ways to preserve what it values most. I see the same spiritual corruption that necessitated the flood beginning to manifest in our modern world. Societies that have forgotten they are loved, governments that pervert justice for profit, religious systems that replace relationship with ritual, economic structures that make poverty profitable while concentrating wealth among those who contribute least to human flourishing. But I also see the same love that preserved Noah's Ark working to preserve hope in our generation. Every genuine act of selfless service, every moment when someone chooses love over profit, every instance when truth prevails over propaganda, every time compassion triumphs over cruelty. These are evidence that the same love operating through Noah's Ark is still actively working to preserve what matters most in human civilization. The angel told me that love always preserves a remnant, that no matter how far creation strays from its purpose, love will always maintain a pathway back to harmony. I believe I'm witnessing that principle in action today. Among the billions of people on earth, love is preserving those who still remember how to love, still choose truth over convenience, still sacrifice for others rather than sacrificing others for themselves. The flood waters have receded, but the love that motivated them hasn't diminished by even the smallest degree. That love is still actively working to preserve what it values, still finding ways to save what seems lost, still refusing to abandon what it has created. The question isn't whether that love exists. The question is whether you're willing to. The rainbow promise still holds. The dove still returns with evidence of renewed life. The ark still floats safely above whatever storms may rage. And love, infinite, personal, actively intervening love, still remembers your name.